One of the more common issues with professional services firm growth is a lack of clarity on who they seek to serve. Creating an ideal client profile is an incredibly useful tool for your firm, both in the short and the long term, and it's the first of the four main pillars in Madison's point of view framework for very good reason. There's data that suggests that firms that align their sales and marketing activities with a very clearly defined ideal client profile see as much as 67% higher conversion rates than ones that don't, which makes sense, right? You're more focused. All of your sales messages, all your marketing messages are more tightly aligned with that specific person that you seek to serve. And so as a result, it's much more resonant with them. In this video, I want to talk about what an ideal client profile is, why it's so valuable, and how you can go about creating one. First, why does it matter? It impacts just about everything that you do. First, it obviously impacts the services that you offer. Different clients have different needs. And so getting clarity on who your client is allows you to align your services or offerings to what their specific needs are. It impacts how you price those services. Different clients have different budget cycles. They have different budgets, period. Some can pay a lot more money than others. Some buy once a year. Some you can buy from any time. They have different expectations in terms of payment structure as well. It obviously impacts the messaging that you use, right? Different clients have different pain points. They perceive benefits differently, and so it'll impact the way that you frame your service offerings. It impacts the marketing channels that you use. Different clients have different places where they go to consume information or to learn. So if your goal is to become a trusted advisor over time, one of the questions is, where do you put that content out there? And that's going to be a function of who it is that you seek to serve. It impacts your business development process. Different clients have different team sizes, different number of stakeholders that are involved in the decision-making process. Your sales cycle might be shorter or longer, or might involve more people or less people. It impacts the team that you hire. Different clients will have different needs in terms of how they are served. Some organizations might be able to get away with relatively junior talent, while other organizations might need very senior people, and it all depends on who the client is in that regard as well. And so ultimately, all of these things impact the financial performance of your business, right? Because your revenues will be different, your margins will be different, your time to collect will be different. It impacts literally everything that you do. Before we get into how to create one, I want to talk a little bit about how you know when you've done it well. How do you know when you have a sufficiently tight ideal client profile? A couple of things to keep in mind. One, do they have a high likelihood of needing what you have to offer? If you were to show that person your service offering, are they going to at least get it? Whether or not they're in a buying window is a different question, but will they at least understand the problem that you're trying to solve? And do they immediately kind of grok it? Number two, do they actually have the budget or the means to become a client? Even if they understand it, but maybe they're too low in the organization to unlock the budget necessary to make it work, that is hyper relevant. And so you want to make sure that your ideal client profile not just has the problem that you're trying to solve, but actually has the budget to do something about it. Number three, are the characteristics easy to identify? And what I mean by that is there are certain types of characteristics, things like company size, things like employee headcount, things like job title, et cetera, demographic criteria that are very easy to find online. Because once you've identified your ideal client profile, you want to build your pool of potential people that you want to reach out to. And if that's very difficult data to come across, then that's going to be an impediment to you actually being able to reach them. Number four, once you apply those filters, is there a large enough business there? Large enough is a subjective kind of thing. Part of that is a function of the typical engagement size. You know, if you're doing 8-figure deals, you maybe don't need a particularly large pool of potential customers. But if your deal size is smaller, that's obviously a variable. And so you want to ask yourself, what is my total addressable market here? And is it large enough to create a viable business? And then lastly, are you able to reach these people easily, ideally through relatively homogeneous marketing channels? Now, again, pricing is a factor here. You can be much more bespoke. You can be much more tailored if you are selling things that have a relatively high price point. But even in that case, you want to still be able to fish in a relatively small number of ponds, so to speak. And so you want to have marketing channels or strategies that will allow you to get in front of as many people as possible. It's not necessarily a deal breaker. I think it depends on the nature of the services that you're providing, but I think it's definitely a variable to keep in mind. So how you go about creating one of these? I've included a link in the description to a ideal client profile template that you can download for yourself. But a couple things to keep in mind. One is you're going to want to cover both the company and the key decision maker within the company. And you want to also make sure that you're covering both the demographic and psychographic aspects of them. So the criteria that's easy to kind of find, and then what is their thought process, right? Because that's going to impact some of the marketing messages that you use. So the first place that we like to start is what we call firmographic fit. And the first place that we generally look is industry. There's this idea of niching down or identifying the niche that you seek to serve. You don't have to do this, but it makes everything that you do so much easier because every marketing message is tailored specifically to those people. You're able to target those specific industry conferences. You're able to price in a way that's advantageous because if I'm hiring a sales consultant who's generic versus a sales consultant whose specialty is accounting firms, I'm usually able to charge a premium. And so there's a lot of advantages to identifying an industry. So that's usually where we start. You can use NAICS codes to try to hone in on who those are, and you can include those in your ideal client profile. But you want to get clear on who the industry or industries are. We then layer on things like headcount, revenue size, that kind of thing. Companies that have a similar number of employees or a similar amount of revenue tend to have similar types of problems. They tend to encounter similar challenges at different stages of the business. And so that can be a very useful filtering mechanism as well. And then you want to ask yourself, does geography matter? The answer is it depends. You can build a successful business either way. There are advantages, especially if you're targeting smaller, to having potentially a geographic focus. A lot of times people will use tools like Google to look for local search results, like they'll look for a local accountant in Chicago, right? There are potentially compelling reasons to focus geographically in scope. If you're selling management consulting services or something like that for enterprise, then obviously you can have national or in some cases even international reach there. But geography is one of the other considerations to layer on in terms of the firmographic aspects of your ideal client profile. Then we want to layer on what I call operational considerations. So this is things like purchasing behavior. A lot of times, large organizations will use procurement departments, for example, to navigate the purchasing process, which means that you might have to be in a competitive bid situation a lot more. You're submitting RFPs, all of that kind of thing. And that's an important consideration, right? Because you have to understand how those departments work. In a lot of cases, they're trying to filter out people rather than let people in. They're going to have requirements around large insurance policies, that kind of thing. Certain team sizes will be important to them. Basically, they're trying to figure out if you're fly by night or not. Another consideration when you think about purchasing behavior is their general willingness to hire consultants at all. Sometimes organizations are shy away from hiring external vendors to try to help them with their problems. They would prefer to deal with them internally. So that's a consideration to keep in mind. Another is sales cycle. So sometimes, and this is probably more a function of the services that you're offering, but sometimes that sales cycle is going to be short, other times it's going to be longer. Depending on the industry that you seek to serve, sometimes they have an annual kind of purchasing cycle. So for example, in higher education, a lot of times they make purchases within a very clearly defined window of time. So you end up creating a sales and business development calendar to align with those windows within which they're most likely to make buying decisions. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then decision makers is another operational factor. Sometimes an organization has a single decision maker and it's a relatively simple process. Other times they have whole committees of people and that draws things out. But it also means that you're needing to make sure that you're speaking to each one of those individual stakeholders in some fashion, either through the proposal or through your business development process to maximize the likelihood that you get the sale. When we look at situational factors, these are harder to come by through secondary research, but they're really useful for identifying buying windows. So things like they just made a senior hire. That person's going to be coming in with a mandate. They're going to want to show some wins, right? And so sometimes they'll be more likely to lean on external vendors to help them accomplish that. Key strategic initiatives that the company is embarking on. This obviously requires some inside knowledge, and in most cases, you need to already know them in order to identify those. Recent acquisitions or investments that they've made. If they got bought, for example, by a PE firm, they probably have some aggressive growth goals, right? And so they might need some help. And then there's the question of like mission value alignment. One benefit of having a clearly defined point of view, which we've talked about elsewhere, and certainly having an ideal client profile is a piece of that. But one of the things that'll come out of it is you are going to have a much clearer explanation of like why you exist as a firm and why other people should care. And that can be very compelling if there is an alignment there or an overlap between your values and theirs. People like to work with people that they like. So those are some of the considerations at an organizational level, but you obviously need to also understand who some of the key decision makers are within that firm and ideally create a persona for each one of those. There's some false precision there. You can do that for too many people. So you want to identify maybe the 3 most important ones. But this is important in terms of understanding some of their motivations, their fears, the upside that they might have in working with you. Certain types of job titles, for example, tend to have certain similar types of pain points and or similar considerations that you need to overcome or objections that you need to overcome. The CTO inside of a firm is going to have different factors that influence their decision than the head of marketing. And so we want to make sure we understand what those are. So when we create a persona for a decision maker within the ideal client profile, we look at things like their job title, obviously, what we think their goals and objectives might be at a high level. And obviously there's nuance within each individual firm there, but I think you can tease out some key themes. What are their key pay points? What are the things that they keep running into in that industry over and over again? That can be really helpful. The reporting structure, who do they report up to? That can be an important consideration. Influencers, these can be people outside of the firm, like experts that they look up to, but it can also be people who they don't necessarily report to, but who have a lot of power inside of an organization. That can sometimes be important. So for example, the CFO often carries a lot of weight inside of an organization. And so I might not report to the CFO, but they can obviously play a huge role in terms of whether or not a deal gets over the finish line. Communication preferences can sometimes be helpful there. Different types of people have different ways in which they prefer to communicate, different frequencies with which they communicate, different expectations around candor, all of that kind of thing. And so those are some things that you can layer in as well. And then things like professional affiliations, associations, conferences that they like to go to, that can be informative in terms of places that you're going to go to reach them. And so keeping that in mind can be super helpful as well. So you've got your ideal client profile. How do you use it? A lot of ways that you can take advantage of it once you've identified it. Obviously, the first one is messaging. So taking a lot of the pain points, taking a lot of the goals and objectives, tying your messaging back to those can be super valuable. It obviously informs your content creation efforts. Your sales playbooks. One of the things that we talk about elsewhere is creating a much more robust and defined sales process and identifying buying windows and identifying what are the order of operations that we are going to execute on a consistent basis in order to turn buying windows into leads and into proposals and that kind of thing. And that gives us talking points that map to their ideal client profile. It helps us understand the nuances of their business and how the decisions are going to get made. And so all that stuff factors into the playbooks that you're going to use from a business development or a sales standpoint. Obviously, the service offerings, it influences. So you might uncover service lines or additional things that you can provide in going through this process that you might not have otherwise thought of. So that can be helpful. New client onboarding. So like knowing how your client operates internally can inform not just the sales process, but delivery as well. And you want to make sure that you start an engagement well and that you kick things off in a way that reassures them and gives them confidence and gives them some quick wins and makes them feel like they made a good choice. It can inform partnership strategies. So there might be service offerings that you know that they need that are complementary, but that you don't want to offer yourself. And so that might inform potential alliances or potential strategic partnerships that you pursue. So it impacts a whole bunch of things that are super important to the business. I think the important thing is to not just have it be an artifact that just sits on a shelf or an exercise that you do one time and then you forget about. You want to embed your understanding of your client and the organization into everything that you do. And also keep in mind, these are things that are not static. You're going to be editing them. You're going to be refining them over time. It's common to take a look at them during an annual strategic planning process, for example, and ask, is there anything that we want to change or modify or expand or remove in this? So that's how you create an ideal client profile. I don't think that this is a nice to have. I think this is something that is any organization would benefit from creating. It'll make it much clearer to you and your team who you're seeking to serve. It'll inform, as I've said, so many aspects of your business and so many aspects of your marketing strategy. It just gets you laser focused on who that ideal client is and makes everything that you do better.